the pipeline troops received their true baptism of fire in Afghanistan. The decision to employ a fuel trunk pipeline for supplying fuel to the troops of the 40th Army was made by the Deputy Minister of Defense for the Rear, Marshal of the Soviet Union, Semyon Kirkokin, following the persistent report of Vasily Nikitin. On the 2nd of January, 1980, Nikitin ordered the head of the operational group of the Central Directorate for Fuel and Lubricants of the Ministry of Defense, Major General Sorenko, to select 2 or 3 pipeline officers with experience in operating fuel trunk pipelines in mountainous terrain. The choice fell on the Chief of Staff of the 95th Pipeline Brigade, Lieutenant Colonel Humyuskov, and the battalion commander, Major Kagramayan, who were summoned to the Central Directorate on the 4th of January. When the telephone message was transmitted, instead of the surname Kagramayan, the name Shein was mistakenly given, and the duty officer of the 95th Pipeline Brigade, knowing the brigade's officers, clarified it as Shein. As a result of this coincidence, Humyuskov and I arrived together to see Nikitin. The Colonel General looked at me and said, "I did not summon you. Where is Kagramayan?" It became clear that a mistake had occurred, but nothing was changed. Nikitin, in the presence of Major General Sorenko, assigned us the task of immediately departing for the city of Termez, organizing the deployment of a fuel trunk pipeline with the crossing of the Amudarya River in the Termez-Hyerton sector, and conducting a reconnaissance of the route Hyerton to Tashkurgan to Aybak to Polikumri. I was issued an identification certificate signed by Nikitin, number 38, dated 4th of January, 1980. Officials of the Turkestan Military District, the Chief of the Rear and the Chief of the Fuel Service treated the idea of using the PMT skeptically. They were satisfied with the work of tanker units and fuel transport battalions and motor transport regiments, which had already been formed by the 10th of January 1980 and were supplying fuel for the introduction of the 40th Army's troops into Afghanistan along the Kabul and Herat axes. Despite this, the 93rd Separate Pipeline Platoon was formed, which ensured the laying of 3 lines of a fuel trunk pipeline from the fuel depot in Termez to its branch in Hyerton. For these purposes, Nikitin, acting like a prudent manager, authorized the shipment from Murgak Station of half a set of PMT-150 to form the platoon and deploy 3 pipeline lines across the Amudarya River. The river is characterized by a very temperamental nature, current speed up to 4 meters a second with variable depths. Despite this, by the end of January the pipeline had been deployed, and the first tons of fuel were delivered onto the territory of Afghanistan. We reported this to Lieutenant General Bazanov, Colonel General Nikitin, and later to Marshal of the Soviet Union Kirkokin, who arrived in Termez. Thus began the use of fuel pipelines in the interests of the 40th Army. Pipelines across the Amudarya periodically failed and were redeployed using various methods. In total, 38 pipeline lines of PMT-150 and PMT-P-150 were lost in the Amudarya. More than 20 years have passed since the start of PMT Operation Afghanistan, and much has been written about pipeline troops. During the period of presence of our limited contingent in Afghanistan, the 276th Pipeline Brigade and the 1461st Separate Pipeline Battalion deployed and operated over 1,200 kilometers of pipelines, led to the most difficult geographic and climatic condition, under constant pressure from bandit formations and the local population. More than 5 million tons of fuel were delivered to the troops of the 40th Army and the Armed Forces of Afghanistan. This amounted to 93% of all fuel supplied to the territory of Afghanistan. But the most difficult time was for the pioneers. The feasibility of delivering fuel across a major water obstacle was proven. Incidentally, in 1980 to 1985, specialists from the USSR Ministry of Oil and Gas Construction and the Volgograd Institute Gibraltar worked on this river section, and concluded that construction of a stationary pipeline at this location was practically impossible due to the river's temperamental nature and the enormous construction cost. Thousands of servicemen passed through the Pipeline Brigade and the Separate Pipeline Battalion in Afghanistan. Some did not return home alive. At the places of their death in Afghanistan, memorials remain, made by soldiers' hands from pipes, vehicle assemblies and components, and local stone. pipeline troops are remembered by local residents to this day. Even then, they were treated with great respect, since for some, the pipeline was a breadwinner, while for others, it inspired fear during the elimination of sabotaging fires on the pipeline. During pipeline operation, fuel losses were significant, 273,000 tons, but this amounted to only about 6% of the total volume delivered. No other mode of transport could have coped with this task under such condition. The problem of supplying fuel to the troops of the 40th Army was solved by our Soviet people in field pipelines. I deliberately mentioned people first, and only then the field pipeline. The reason is that prior to the withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan, a pipeline regiment of the armed forces of the DRA was formed, whose personnel underwent several months of training under the guidance of our specialists at the base of the 276 Pipeline Brigade. However, at the end of 1989, after the withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan, I personally had to see on the route of the field pipeline, Hyerton to Mazar Sharif, that Afghan pipeline troops were unable to operate the pipeline even on flat terrain. Only our people, under the leadership of officers and warrant officers, true pipeline professionals, were able, in the most difficult geographic and climatic conditions, to deploy and operate a field pipeline.
With a sense of bitterness, one recalls the organizational and table of organization reforms of 1980. Initially in January of 1980, on the basis of the Brigade's Motor Transport Battalion, a separate Motor Transport Battalion was formed, which was soon sent to the Republic of Afghanistan as part of the 59th Separate Brigade of Material Support, 59th ABRMO. In April 1980, on the basis of the 14th Separate Pipeline Battalion, 14th OTPBR, a reinforced pipeline battalion with a strength of 525 personnel, under the command of Major V.V. Velichka, was formed and likewise sent to the DRA. And in June, it was the turn of the remaining part of the brigade. It was redeployed to the Belarusian military district, where it was subsequently reorganized into the Cadre 7th Pipeline Brigade. 42nd OTPBR was transferred to the Transbaikal military district. It is evidently necessary to dwell on the activities of the 276th Pipeline Brigade and the 1461st Separate Pipeline Battalion in the limited contingent of Soviet forces, OKSV, in the DRA, which formed the backbone of the fuel supply system created there. They ensured the delivery of up to 80% of the total volume of fuel supplies to the troops along two axes, Kabul and Kushka, and, together with fuel depots connected to the pipelines, created a kind of pipeline and storage system in its modern sense. Connected to the field trunk pipelines were two district fuel depots, numbered 1565 Termez and numbered 1566 Kushka, two transshipment-based fuel depots, number 6685 Hayratan and number 718 Turangundi, three army fuel depots, number 1386 Pul-i-Khumri, number 6530 Bagram, and number 1572 Shindad, three fuel depots of the armed forces of the DRA, Pul-i-Khumri, Bagram, and Shindad, and two airfields, Bagram and Shindad, with a total tankage capacity of over 160,000 meters cubed. By the end of 1984 to the beginning of 1985, the network of field trunk pipelines on the territory of the DRA had a total length of about 1,200 kilometers, and their share of the total volume of fuel delivery in the quote-unquote district ABRMO echelon was decisive. For example, in 1986, the total volume of fuel delivered to the territory of the DRA amounted to 652.2 thousand tons. By transport mode, it was distributed as follows: pipelines, 494.8 thousand tons, or 76%. Water transport, 49.6 thousand tons, 7.6%. Motor transport, 107.8 thousand tons, 16.4%. In subsequent years, the total volume of fuel delivery fluctuated, showing a clear downward trend towards the beginning of the troop withdrawal process from Afghanistan and the reduction of fuel consumption. However, the share of pipeline transport in the total delivery volume remained predominant. In total, during the period of the pipeline operation in the DRA, about 5.4 million tons of fuel were delivered into its territory. Such was the state of affairs regarding the combat employment of field pipelines in the DRA at the moment when, in late January of 1985, I assumed position of Chief of the Fuel Service in the Turkmenistan Military District. This situation and the actual condition of the pipelines, from the standpoint of network layout and operation, fully corresponded to the operational environment and directions of troop actions and allowed the assigned tasks of timely fuel delivery to the OKSV troops to be carried out with quality. However, the real situation of the 276th Pipeline Brigade and the 1461st Separate Pipeline Battalion was far from favorable. In the brigade, along with such negative factors as a large number of incidents and crimes, unjustifiably frequent forced shutdowns, and pipeline accidents, there was a certain diminution in the sense of responsibility of the brigade leadership for the state of affairs. Particularly unpleasant was the presence of large, if not enormous, fuel losses, for which the necessary decisions had not been taken. Thus, in 1984, combat fuel losses amounting to about 18.9 thousand tons were not written off, corresponding to an almost astronomical for the time total sum of about 1.7 million rubles. The 1461st OTPBR at the end of January 1985 began transitioning the pipeline to operational regime, but due to inefficient experience in organizing a dispatcher service and the low professional training of certain officers, this process proceeded slowly, with large fuel losses, 22 to 25% compared to 7% in the brigade. All this required the adoption of immediate and decisive measures to rectify the situation. Without going into details, it should only be emphasized that such administrative, organizational, technical, and technological measures were soon undertaken, and they yielded certain results. In particular, in 1985, losses in the brigade were reduced to 5% of pumped volume of fuel. In the battalion, they amounted to less than 10%. Moreover, the entire personnel of the brigade and battalion were oriented toward higher quality work aimed at increasing pipeline reliability and reducing fuel losses. Subsequently, efforts in the area were not relaxed, which made it possible, by the time of the withdrawal of the brigade and battalion from the DRA to district territory, to completely clear all of its quote-unquote tails, with decisions taken on all combat losses. Invaluable assistance at the moment was also provided by the leadership of CURTG MO, at whose petition the Minister of Defense in 1986 carried out a one-time write-off of all previously accumulated fuel losses, and also expanded the authority of officials of the OKSV and the Turkestan Military District to write off combat fuel losses. Moreover, in the subsequent period of operation of field pipelines, despite constant pressure on the pipeline facilities from bandit formations in the local population, attention to reducing fuel losses only intensified. One may even conclude that the final stage, from 1986 to 1989, the command of pipeline units was assigned to two main tasks: reduction of fuel losses and the preservation of personnel, although requirements for pipeline operation stability were not reduced. Thus, in order to reduce the impact on pipelines by the local population with the aim of fuel theft, by decision of the Deputy Minister of Defense for the Rear, Chief of the Rear of the Armed Forces, fuel was distributed to the civilian population as humanitarian aid in volumes of up to 3,000 tons per year. At the same time, agreements were concluded with the village elders for the protection of pipelines. In confirmation with the constant attention to reducing fuel losses, several excerpts may be recited from the report by the commander of the 276th Pipeline Brigade, Colonel S.N. Kovalenko, in September of 1988, 3 months before the brigade's withdrawal from the DRA. He reported, "In the formation and its units, a system of hourly, daily, and monthly control and analysis of fuel pumping results has long been established. In subunits, units, and formation headquarters, there is a constant search for conditions and methods to improve work. Strengthening the importance, attention, and control of the dispatcher service served to reduce fuel losses per sabotage incident from 19.1 tons in January to 6.3 tons in September. I believe that when comparing pipeline performance results with previous years, one cannot fail to take into account the current situation. The increase of combat fuel losses from 8.9% to 12.4% occurred alongside an 80% increase in the number of sabotage acts over the compared period, from 1,511 to 2,730. Indeed, the situation along the pipeline route was quite tense and often changed sharply. a rare day passed when the personnel of pumping station garrisons could calmly attend to their duties. They were constantly on readiness to deploy to the route to eliminate accidents or damage resulting from sabotage, of which up to 10 or more per day were carried out. Looking back and evaluating the events of those years, one comes to the conclusion that our attitude towards the nature and essence of combat losses, the methods for calculating their quantitative indicators, and, of course, the very approach to the documentary formalization of sustaining documents for taking write-off decisions was, to put it mildly, not always professional. The fact of the matter was that there was no prior exchange of long-term operation of field trunk pipelines for delivering real, not quote-unquote conditional, petroleum products, especially under conditions of mountainous desert terrain with sharp temperature fluctuations of ambient air and under constant influence from one's own troops, bandit formations, and the local population. There was no clear division of the very concepts of quote-unquote combat losses and quote-unquote technological losses. The only officially established indicator for writing off losses consisted of norms of natural loss during pipeline operation, which, in turn, did not take into account the specific conditions of pipeline operation in the DRA. In the first years of pipeline operation in the DRA, measures to eliminate these shortcomings were not undertaken. The generalization of available data on the actual losses from various types of combat and technical damage, bullet hits, demolitions, fires, sock cuts, uncouplings, vehicle impacts, etc., was not carried out, and, accordingly, no specific proposals were developed for their approval. Only in January to February of 1985 did a CURTG-MO commission conduct studies of real losses for various types of damage. Based on the results, a corresponding instruction was developed and approved, which subsequently made it possible to significantly streamline the determination and documentary formalization of losses by each type of damage, which, in turn, provided substantial assistance in the write-off of fuel losses. After the decision was made to withdraw the OKSV from the DRA and transfer all material assets to the Afghan side, the pipeline troops were tasked with training pipeline personnel for the armed forces of the DRA. In execution of these decisions, the Afghan side formed a separate pipeline regiment and battalion, whose strength approximately corresponded to that of the 276th Pipeline Brigade and the 1461st OTPBR, respectively. They were stationed near the command posts of our units. Initial training of Afghan pipeline personnel was conducted at the unit level by our servicemen, with the involvement of officers of the Ulyanovsk Higher Military Technical School, specially deployed to the DRA. Subsequently, all personnel of the regiment and battalion were distributed and stationed near our garrisons, and training was conducted on site. The withdrawal of pipeline units from the territory of the DRA was carried out in accordance with an approved plan. The 1461st OTPBR, operating on the Herat axis, was withdrawn to the Kiev Military District. The 276th Pipeline Brigade was redeployed to the Turkestan Military District, where it was subsequently reorganized to a cadre brigade and stationed in the settlement of Aktash, Samarkand Oblast. Pipeline lines were transferred to the Afghan side in operating condition, together with all buildings and structures, with existing fuel stocks in the lines, at pumping stations, and in intermediate tank groups, as well as pumping means, pipes, and equipment. Service and barracks facilities were transferred in serviceable condition with all equipment, furniture, and bedding. The transfer was carried out by operational sections, with the execution of bilateral acts. Overall, the withdrawal proceeded strictly according to the approved plan, in an organized manner and without significant difficulties. It should be noted that the transferred pipeline lines ceased functioning literally within a matter of hours after the withdrawal of our personnel from the initial points, despite the presence of fuel and the serviceability of all technological equipment. Subsequently, the Afghan side repeatedly attempted to bring the pipelines to an operational regime, especially on the Termez axis, but these attempts were unsuccessful. Assessing overall the work of the pipeline troops in the DRA, it must be noted that they successfully coped with the tasks of timely and uninterrupted fuel delivery to the troops. Personnel worked selflessly, purposefully, and with initiative, constantly seeking out and implementing unused reserves to better accomplish both general and specific tasks. For courage and self-sacrifice, high professionalism in the performance of military duty, more than 1,500 pipeline troops were awarded government decorations of the USSR and the DRA.
I began thinking about service in the pipeline troops back when I was a fifth-year cadet. What attracted me was the supposedly broad field of activity and the large number of personnel. I did not yet know about the cadre pipeline units. I wrote a letter asking the brigade commander in the Trans-Baikal Military District, Colonel A.V. Shvetsov, to take me into his unit, and received a positive reply. Then I submitted a report requesting that after graduation I be assigned to a pipeline brigade, and I attached A.V. Shvetsov's reply to it. During the posting process after graduation from the Uchilitsie, I had a conversation with Major General A.G. Kartashov. In response to my explanation that I was drawn to interesting and live work with personnel, he said that he would promise me service in the Far East a bit later, but for now, I would have to serve in a training pipeline battalion, St. Eleno, where things were also very interesting. I accepted this assignment without great enthusiasm, but later I recalled those years of service there with gratitude. In the training battalion, I gained a certain amount of practical experience working with technical equipment, conducted classes on the deployment, operation, and rollback of the PMT, took part in testing new pipelines, PMTB-200, PMTP-160, and pumping equipment, PNU-200, PPU-500, which later proved very useful to me. Looking back, I can say with confidence that it is impossible to obtain such experience in cadre pipeline brigades. Later, when I was in Afghanistan, I noted how difficult it was, not only for my peers, but also for older comrades who did not have practical experience behind them. Thus, in 1982, 5 of us arrived at the training battalion: K. Ermenko, D.I. Melnikov, S.U. Podoroznikov, V.P. Romanov, and V.A. Sorokin. I assumed the position of instructor commander of a training platoon in the company of Captain A.A. Markelov, who devoted a great deal of effort and energy to my development. Quite often on weekends, A.A. Markelov, A.A. Gribkov, commander of the 2nd platoon, and I went out to the training pipeline range, where they taught me the basics of practical work with the equipment, things that had not been learned during training at the Uchilitsie. We maintained warm and friendly relations for a long time, even after my departure to another duty station. Unfortunately, A.A. Markelov has already passed away. The first half year of service was quite interesting. I trained junior specialists, and at the same time studied together with them, forgetting about weekends. Every day, a platoon commander had to be present at morning reveille and at lights out for the personnel. Daily classes, preparation for which continued well past midnight, unloading arriving sets and shipping pipeline sets to Afghanistan, as a rule at night, tests of new equipment. Such was the specific character of our service. They were making officers out of us. Not once did I hear from my fellow servicemen the words tired, can't, or don't want to. Time flew by quickly. At the exams of the 2nd Vypusк of cadets, my platoon received a grade of excellent. Since the training process repeated with a periodicity of half a year, teaching began to feel a bit routine, and I started thinking about service in Afghanistan. The first attempt was quite unsuccessful and took the form of writing a report to the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel N.M. Bobryshev. Nikolai Mikhailovich had a friendly talk with me, making it clear that I would be serving under his command for a long time yet. In the spring of 1983, Colonel V.P. Bulgakov came to us for the graduation examinations, and at some point I was called in for a conversation with him. Officers were being selected for assignment to Afghanistan. Naturally, I agreed without hesitation. In addition to me, V.P. Romanov, in Afghanistan he was awarded the Order of the Red Star and the Medal for Courage. V.A. Sorokin and S.U. Podoroznikov were selected. In October 1983, we arrived in Tashkent, where we were briefed by the Chief of the Fuel Service of the Turkestan Military District, Colonel U.P. Belusov. Having received preventive vaccinations, on 24th October we flew to Kabul and arrived at the transit point, where we languished for 8 days in a tent, By day, scorching heat, by night, cold. Awaiting the processing of documents. We got to the command post of the Pipeline Brigade in Puli Kumri by passing transport due to non-flying weather. Here, we were from 6th to 9th November. We spoke with the brigade commander, Colonel V.I. Memek, the Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel V.P. Krasnikov, and the senior engineer, Major V.V. Zareda. I was appointed commander of 1st Platoon of 1st Company of 3rd Battalion. I arrived at the company's control point, NS-39, Tereshkov Turn, by the end of November 9th, reported to the company commander, Captain G.A. Shumikin, and on November 10th, to the battalion commander, Major V.P. Tusangu. During the next 2 weeks, I participated in work laying a protective casing on the PMTP-100 pipeline running through the Selang Tunnel. The work was performed only at night, when motor vehicle movement was prohibited. Along the working line of the PMTP-100, 2 more lines were laid in parallel, simultaneously pulling them inside the PMTB-200 pipeline. Then, they were covered with rectangular concrete boxes, and canvas bags filled with sand were laid on top of them, to protect the pipeline from being driven over by tracked and wheeled vehicles. The pipeline laid through the pass evoked a feeling of pride for its creators and those who laid it among impassable gorges. There were places where the pipeline simply hung, like bunches of grapes, over precipices. According to accounts, in the autumn of 1982, about 300 people died in the tunnel itself from poisoning by exhaust gases. After this accident, movement through the pass began to be carried out only in one direction every other day. On even-number days, vehicles drove towards Kabul, and on odd-number days towards the USSR. The only exception to this rule was for the pipeline troops. On any day and at any time of day, we passed unimpeded in the required direction. The pass served as a permit, pipes loaded into the truck bed or tied to the side of a BTR-60. After the work in the Selang Tunnel, I departed to take over my platoon. I was glad when among the personnel I saw 4 former MI cadets from the training battalion. I received the affairs and the position from Lieutenant A.A. Petrasov. One of his parting admonitions was this: you should fear not the bullet that flew past, but the next one. Interaction was immediately established with the platoon commander from 2nd Battalion, Lieutenant A.P. Kopkin. He unfailingly helped me, allocating a patrol vehicle. I helped him as well, when eliminating accidents on his sector. To my surprise, the company commander, Captain G.A. Shumikin, did not support me in this. I could not understand why I could not begin eliminating an accident where fuel was leaking, even if it was not on my sector. But I could get there in 5-10 minutes at most, whereas it would take A.P. Kopkin no less than 30. Turned out everything was much simpler. G.A. Shumikin and V.A. Mikhalikov, commander of the 2nd Company of 2nd Battalion, were competing in this way for the smallest fuel losses on their company sectors. My platoon sector had a length of about 15 kilometers in a single line. Pumping was carried out by 3 pumping stations, 33, 34, and 35. And at each one, a single PNU 100-200M unit operated. The elevation difference between the initial and final points of the pipeline, the sector ended near NS-36, reached 1 kilometer. That is, when pumping aviation kerosene, about 80 atmospheres. And the average distance between pumping stations was about 3 kilometers. The sector was among the most troublesome. The foot of the pass and the vegetated mountains provided good concealment and created favorable conditions for band formations to fire on motor columns and to damage the pipeline. The first 2 garrisons were located in the center of Afghan kishlaks. Knowing the Afghan mentality, we were forced to remain constantly on edge, especially at night. The platoon commander was located at the NS-33 garrison, at the junction of the sectors of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions. 3 to 5 kilometers from us, in Kinsan, there were stationed a tank battalion, in whose area of responsibility our company sector fell, and the command post of a road commandant brigade. The personnel were housed in a residential building, which, for a certain fee, was provided by its owner, a wealthy Afghan. By the way, the Hosayan had 7 sons. As he himself said, 3 served in the Afghan army, Sarandoi, and 4 were rebels, but that did not prevent them all from meeting quite often. The house was built of clay. Even the floors had to be regularly moistened with water. For lack of window glass, the frames were covered with polyethylene film. Over time, we improved it. We poured concrete floors and covered them with PVC tiles, sheathed the walls with boards from boxes for artillery shells, and hung silk curtains on the windows. We ran lighting into every room, there were 6, from the generator and the accumulator batteries of the pumping unit. The dwelling turned out quite cozy, and in the spring of 1984, near the pumping station, we even built a pool measuring 5 by 3 meters. The NS-33 garrison consisted of 7 men, including the platoon commander and 2 soldiers attached from the tank battalion with an ancient BTR-60, which served us both for security and as a patrol emergency vehicle. The crew members, during accidents on the pipeline, worked like experienced pipeline troops.
Первый, я 357-й. На 28-м пикете. Отпущен хомут. Принимаю меры по устранению неисправности. Вас понял.
Проверь справа. Проверь хомут. Тяни.
Первый. Я 357-й. Течь устранена. Продолжаю патрулирование. Вас понял.
By the way, armored personnel carriers were assigned only to those platoons whose sectors were considered the most dangerous. The others went out to the line either in vehicles or in armored equipment summoned directly from security units. How was the pipeline guarded? A mortar battery located 2 kilometers from NS-33 controlled a section of line only about 800 meters long, within line of sight. Approximately the same sections were controlled by 2 outlying posts, posted by the tank battalion in daylight. 1 kilometer from the mortar battery was NS-34, 5 men, under the command of Sergeant V.V. Goderski Tversko. Here, there was also, though inoperative, a BTR-60 with a single crew member, a machine gunner. Then, 3 kilometers from NS-34 was NS-35, also 5 men. Living quarters for personnel in these garrisons were built by our own forces. The space between 2 wooden panels, installed parallel, was filled with cobblestones and poured with cement mortar. Such was the technology. Then, the formwork was moved and the process repeated. The roof was covered with damaged but straight pipes and concreted. A meter-thick layer of clay was poured on top, which provided a tolerable climate indoors. For cooking, we had compact field kitchens, and once a week the company sergeant major brought supplies. Considering that we had to work around the clock, sleeping in snatches, the provisions, issued strictly by norms, were not enough. Often, the Afghans helped out. In exchange for permission to collect the fuel spilled during accidents, they brought us lavash, and sometimes even Fanta. The thing was that we simply had nothing and nowhere to pump out the spilled fuel, and so, as not to set it on fire, we allowed the Afghans to collect it. With tin cans, rags, and sponges, they scooped kerosene puddles into their containers, leaving behind an exceptionally clean patch of ground. On days when fuel was not being pumped through the pipeline, Afghans came to the garrison asking to pour kerosene into their jerry cans. We give them a mixture of kerosene with diesel fuel that was collected from leaks at the end seals and stored in 200-liter barrels. This mixture was burned at night to light the area. Through the pipeline, we continuously supplied fuel for jet engines, mainly, and diesel fuel. When there was a need to pump diesel fuel, kerosene was displaced by diesel fuel by direct contact method, and vice versa. Stops during normal operation of the pipeline occurred rather rarely, at most 7 to 8 days a month, when the storage facilities of the terminal point were filled with fuel. Short stops from 20 minutes to 2 hours occurred almost daily, while eliminating an accident on someone's sector. But this time was fully sufficient for us to service the pumping stations. After such brief stops, especially in summer, it was quite difficult to bring the pipeline back to pumping Rezim. In the sun, the pipeline heated up so much that the pressure in it exceeded 60 atmospheres due to expansion of the pumped fuel. In such situations, there was often cases of pipe rupture along weld seams. Before replacing failed pipes, we had to shoot through 1 to 2 good pipes located higher up the sector in order to bleed off pressure, otherwise it was impossible to drive the detachable sleeve under the bell. From the high pressure, once even the pump at the pumping unit at NS-33 cracked. After this case, during periods when pumping was stopped, the engine operators unscrewed the additional gearbox cooling lines to bleed off excess pressure, since the valves installed in the piping could not ensure a tight shutoff of the pipeline. Where possible, we laid the pipeline itself into nearby Rieke to cool off the pump fuel. To check the pipeline route and worked with personnel in the garrisons, I went out in a BTR-60 with a driver and 1 pipeline man, who was also the machine gunner. In the troop compartment of the BTR-60, there was always loaded assembly tools, a valve, and inserts of various lengths. And on the sides, at least 4 pipes were tied. If conditions allowed, we eliminated the discovered accident, 3 of us. If the accident was large scale, more than 2 to 3 pipes punctured or crushed, or a fire, we had to take 2 pipeline men from each pumping station and sometimes even a second BTR-60, onto which at times we loaded up to 20 pipes. To eliminate accidents, in accordance with an order of the commander of the 40th Army, we were supposed to go out only under cover of an armored group from the motor rifle tank units, in whose zone of responsibility the given pipeline sector fell. In reality, it did not always work out that way. First, the pipeline was shot through off schedule, and more often at night, and at that time an armored group for route checks was not allocated at all. Only in cases of a real accident, which is rather difficult to determine by the pressure gauges of pumping stations, if the hole is less than the diameter of a bullet. Second, and most importantly, after we discovered an accident on the pipeline and reported it to the tank battalion commander, the armored group could arrive no earlier than in 30 to 40 minutes. This option did not suit us. We needed to stop the fuel leak faster. At best, the armored group arrived when the accident elimination was nearing completion, but quite often, we met the representative of the motor rifle unit already at the pumping station, where we completed the paperwork on the incident.
640 стрелы на приеме, прием.
В районе населенного пункта Самсулак. Между 21-м и 23-м ГНС пожар на трассе. Как поняли? Прием.
Вас понял, конец связи. Картина 640-го. Я 640-й стрелы. В районе населенного пункта Самсулак пожар. Работу с 21-го гарнизона остановить. На трассу выслать патрульную команду, пожарную машину под прикрытием бронегруппы.
I wrote a report to the commander of the pipeline company that in such and such a period of time, between such and such garrisons, as a result of the actions of band formations, so many pipes had been punctured, pipes replaced with new ones. As a result of the accident, so many tons of fuel had been leaked. The report had to be signed by 1 to 2 pipeline men and by 2 representatives of the armored group, one of them an officer. Naturally, we were interested in indicating the largest possible fuel losses, while the representatives from the infantry were the opposite, as a result of which, bargaining always took place between us on mutually advantageous terms. Pipes were punctured both for theft of pumped fuel and in order to disable the entire pipeline. Thus, movement on the road was blocked, and the Dushmans could shoot motor columns. Pressure in the pipeline reached 40 kilograms force per square centimeter, so it was enough to shoot through a pipe and set the leaking fuel on fire. The Struya would block the entire road section. More than once, the Mujahideen, during the movement of motor columns over the pass, speed did not exceed 10 to 15 kilometers, shot through the pipeline for grenade launchers and heavy machine guns. Under high pressure, the fuel hit a vehicle and ignited, and as a result of which the vehicle burned completely, sometimes even with the driver. From personal experience, I note that in a summer, a spill of fuel, diesel fuel and kerosene, on asphalt ignites from 3 to 5 tracer bullets fired from an assault rifle, or from one single one from a heavy machine gun. And yet, knowing these methods, I myself once got into a similar situation with the patrol emergency team. In the summer of 1984, the tank battalion commander replaced my BTR-60 with a BTR-70. My joy and pride knew no bounds, since no commander of a pipeline platoon had a BTR-70, especially an almost new one. I enjoyed it no more than 10 days. Going out to another accident, one pipe had been damaged, we, as always, stopped the new BTR-70 by the Probojna, so as not to carry pipes and assembly tools far, and began eliminating the accident. As a rule, when replacing one pipe, they did not stop fuel pumping through the pipeline, but only reduced engine revolutions at the previous pumping station. Naturally, we did not know that the Dushmans had prepared an ambush at this place for a descending column of Afghan tankers, and the BTR-70 standing on the road hindered them. The Afghans knew our old BTR-60, but the new one, apparently, they took as belonging to a motor rifle unit. At the moment the column approached the accident site, a grenade launcher shot was fired near us along the pipeline, after which the BTR-70, like a matchbox, almost instantly caught fire from the fuel flowing onto it from the pipes. The fight was brief. Reinforcements reached us very quickly. The consequence of this ambush was 2 burned fuel tankers of the Afghan army and our new BTR-70. During the firefight, we managed to take cover behind large boulders, but in doing so, I received light shrapnel wounds to my right leg. Medical aid was provided to me by a Feldschirr from the tank battalion. After this incident, they returned to me the old BTR-60, which served us faithfully for a long time. Much has been said about how, and with what technical approaches, Afghans stole fuel from the pipeline, so there is no need to repeat it here. One thing can be said, there were very many such cases. I will tell about one interesting variant. 1 kilometer from NS-34, there was a Chaikana, with a small automobile workshop, where Afghan drivers, who did not manage to cross the pass, would stop for the night. The pipeline lying nearby with fuel caused them great temptation. Under cover of night, they punctured the pipes and, using hoses, made a branch refueling network for their vehicles. Fuel was poured both into the tanks of vehicles and into tanker trucks, if there were any. Knowing that vehicles had stopped near the Chaikana, we constantly guarded them at night, yet we never managed to catch anyone red-handed. We were simply witnesses to what had happened, and at the same time, neither in the Chaikana nor in the cabins of the vehicles was there a single living soul. The punctured pipe was replaced with a new one, and we took away all hoses and canisters. There were cases, let's be honest, when we shot out the tires of vehicles standing under refueling and removed their batteries as compensation for the moral and material ущерб we had incurred. Early in the morning, under our supervision, all vehicles drove off, even on flat tires, and those without batteries were towed. Conversations with the owner of the Chaikana about the inadmissibility of such actions produced no positive results, and after 3 to 5 days, everything repeated again. In spring 1984, the brigade command decided to lay a second line of PMTP-100 over the Selang Pass to supply diesel fuel to the terminal point of the pipeline, Bagram. Looking ahead, I note that subsequently, we had to pump not only diesel but also jet fuel along the new line, moreover, along 2 lines simultaneously. This was connected with the high consumption of aviation kerosene by the Army aviation stationed in the Bagram area. The main work of pipeline installation was performed by a team of 15 men from the 1st Pipeline Battalion. It was assigned sequentially to each platoon commander for work on laying out and installing the pipeline on his sector. As security, 2 armored personnel carriers with crews and a dismount of 2 to 3 men were constantly alongside the manual installation team. The 2nd PMTP-100 pipeline from Puli Kumri to Bagram was installed in record short time and put into operation no later than 1 month from the start of its installation. During deployment, only 1 case of the manual installation team being fired upon was noted, on the northern side of the pass in the area of Jabal Usaraj, fortunately without casualties. In summer 1984, a new commander of the 3rd Pipeline Battalion arrived, Major A.G. Grigoriev, who, during his familiarization with us, presented me with senior lieutenant's shoulder boards. It so happened that literally a week after this significant event, I had to save his life, as he himself wrote in the citation for awarding me the Medal for Courage. On one of the August days, in the gorge between NS-34 and NS-35, the Dushmans устроили an ambush on an Afghan column of tankers. The first BRDM, moving at the head of the column, was knocked out by a grenade launcher, as a result of which movement on the road was blocked. KAMAZ, tractor-trailers with semi-trailers, could neither drive around the knocked-out BRDM nor turn around and leave the kill zone. Without thinking long, the Afghan drivers themselves shot through the pipeline, as later vyasnilось, in the hope that pipeline troops, together with an armored group, would soon arrive to help them. Having established a fuel leak by the pressure gauges, we headed to the site of the presumed accident, having first informed the company control point and the tank battalion commander. Near NS-34, firing could already be clearly heard, and characteristic thick clouds of black smoke were pouring from around the bend. Envisioning the scale of the accident, I reported this by radio and gave the command to stop pumping. Loading both armored personnel carriers with all the pipes available in the garrison, the group of 7 men drove into the gorge. The scene that opened up promised nothing good. On the road, under the piercing howl of bursting tires, a BRDM and 2 KAMAZ vehicles were blazing, and along the shoulder, burning kerosene flowed in a fiery struya. Pumping through the pipeline had already been stopped, but the fuel in the pipes was flowing out of the Probonye, downward along the main magistral, burning out the rubber sealing rings of the undamaged pipes. From under the burning rubber rings, kerosene hissed as it burst outward, thereby adding oil to the fire. At first, it seemed to me, they don't say for nothing that fear has big eyes, that no less than 1 kilometer of pipeline was burning. But subsequently, we replaced, along the combined route, only 20 pipes. Having fired a couple bursts from the heavy machine guns into the unknown, we placed our BTR-60s on the roadside, of the opposite side of the road, and, for safety, left the vehicles. On one side, we were covered from fire by our own and burning equipment, and on the other, by a sheer cliff. The Dushmans conducted aimed fire mainly at the Afghan servicemen from the motor column. They had already done everything they could with the pipe. And return fire, including ours, was wasted since the echo of the firing in the mountains did not allow determining the enemy firing points. When bright flashes were detected on the opposite side of the mountain, we opened return fire, but apparently our automatic bursts did not find a target, though, who knows. After 30 to 40 minutes of our being in the fire zone and chaotic shooting, Major A.G. Grigoriev arrived at the site of the sabotage. Being a brave and courageous officer, earlier in such situations senior command did not appear. He stopped his BRDM next to our armored personnel carriers and headed towards us, not seeing us. Because of the continuous roar of shooting around, my shout to him about the need to move crawling he did not hear. When he had walked about 10 meters and drew level with me, sharply grabbed him by the leg and sealily dragged him behind a large boulder where I myself was hiding from fire. Literally, in the next seconds, at the very spot where A.G. Grigoriev had been, an explosion sounded from a grenade fired from a grenade launcher. We only looked at each other. At that time, 5 tanks that had arrived were firing from the ground into the mountains, and from the air, the rocky terrain was being worked over by 2 pairs of helicopters. After 2 to 2.5 hours, the shooting ended, and, after the tanks dragged away the knocked-out equipment, we began restoring the pipeline. After 30 minutes of work, fuel supply through the pipeline was resumed. From the high temperature of the blazing fire, all replaced pipes were twisted into spirals and had not only bullet holes, but also torn places from tanks driving over them while maneuvering. The consequence of this sabotage was 3 burned KAMAZ vehicles and 1 BRDM. 3 servicemen of the Afghan army were killed. 2 weeks later, again on the sector between NS-34 and NSM-35, a real slaughter unfolded, which continued throughout the day. Early in the morning, a column of 20 BMPs passed by NS-33. Looking at the moving column, at first I thought about the carelessness of the personnel, who rode on the armor without having weapons with them, and moreover, most of them were barefoot and undressed, sunbathing. And then I decided, what did they have to fear when such an armada of armored vehicles was moving? No band would dare make a single shot. However, I was mistaken because this column was already being awaited. The Dushmans use a tried and true method of combat operations. They deliberately waited for the moment when as many vehicles as possible had entered the gorge, thus ending up in the kill zone. They almost simultaneously knocked out 2 infantry fighting vehicles, one at the head and the second in the middle of the column. Thus, 10 BMPs, 2 BTRs, and a special communications vehicle found themselves in a fire sack. Instantly, the pipeline turned into a blazing torch, setting 2 more vehicles on fire. After that, the bandits simply methodically shot from the mountains at the remaining equipment and personnel. Most of the dead were among those who were on the armor at that moment and were not ready to conduct combat. The BMPs themselves were unable to offer any resistance since their guns did not elevate beyond 50 degrees, and they could not hit enemy firing positions located higher in the mountains. The helicopters that arrived worked the slopes with rockets. The crackle of the band's heavy machine guns did not subside. Additional forces and means were prevented from breaking through to help by the 2 burning BMPs, which had to be pulled off the road. The heavy density of fire did not allow the crews of the tanks that had arrived to hook tow cables to evacuate the damaged equipment. On top of everything else, the ammunition in them began to explode. The special communications vehicle was under threat of capture by the bandits. It stood undamaged. And then the tank battalion commander ordered it to be shot up by a tank, which was done. As a result of this battle, 6 BMPs, 2 BTRs, and a special communications vehicle were knocked out and burned. Personally, I saw 18 bodies of the dead and many human fragments. The real losses were certainly greater. We eliminated the consequences of the sabotage already in complete darkness, by the light of floodlights, when the main forces of the motor rifle units had departed, leaving us 4 BTRs for cover. In total, we replaced 87 punctured, crushed, and burned pipes, and at 3 a.m. the following day began supplying fuel through the pipeline. This story had a continuation. During the battle, a group of retreating Dushmans came out on us, and we opened fire on it. Help arrived to us, and soon that group was finished off. After that, unpleasant things began to happen on the platoon sector that had not occurred earlier. Twice at night, at an interval of 3 days, the Dushmans placed for us the bodies of killed Afghans. In the first case, the pipeline had been предварительно shut through. All the following day, local residents were occupied only with talk that the pipeline troops at night by the pipe had shot a man. These conversations did not benefit us in any way. Obviously, that was the aim of the Dushman's actions. 3 days later, the same case repeated. The body was buried by local residents. The situation in the Kishlaks heated up. It was clear that these corpses were being planted deliberately, and someone was thus turning the local residents against us. About 2 weeks later, it became clear that among the group we had fired on were relatives of local residents. In accordance with customs, it was necessary to take revenge for dead relatives, and I was chosen as the vinovnik. By decision of the command, until the situation was settled, I was replaced by Lieutenant V.A. Zolotov. He said that the Afghans for quite a long time still asked where the old commandor had gone. I soon received a new task. In September through October 1984, work was carried out to replace the PMTP-100 pipeline on the Karaton-Puli-Kumri direction with the PMTP-150 pipeline. From each battalion, a team of 25 men was allocated to carry out this task. I was entrusted to head the team from the 3rd Battalion. First, we dismantled 2 PMTP-150 lines from the Amudarya to the fuel depot in Karaton. It is interesting to note that the line along which diesel fuel was pumped was dismantled easily. In the same line, along which gasoline was supplied, the rubber sealing rings had become hard and completely lost elasticity. In addition, many soyadininya were filled with compacted sand. Sometimes, after driving the detachable sleeve into the connection with a sledgehammer, it was necessary to tear the pipe off the line with the help of a vehicle. The allocated teams performed the following operations: unloading pipes from rail cars and Karaton, preparing pipes for installation. Initially, it was planned to rotate the teams. Our team installed 7 kilometers of PMTP-150 in a day. By my calculations, it was possible to install 10 kilometers as well, but pipes were delivered with interruptions. The teams from the 1st and 2nd Battalions installed 3 and 4 kilometers of pipeline, respectively, during the day. I proposed to the brigade commander, Colonel V.V. Boyko, that only our team should do the installation. The work would be continuous, people would get into a rhythm, requirements for safety engineering would be strictly observed. This proposal was accepted. Our team carried out installation of the line all the way to Pulikumri. To increase the reliability of assembly, personnel were distributed as follows: laying out, 10 men; checking completeness of the bells, 2; installation, 6; control of completeness of assembly, 3. In camp, we left 4 men as internal detail and for cooking. The average tempo of installing 150 km of pipeline was about 8 kilometers per day. Depending on terrain and the presence of naselenie punkti, from 3 to 11.5 kilometers of pipeline was installed daily. Such a strict odnoshenie to the quality of installation gave its results. When filling the entire sector of 150 kilometers, not a single accident occurred connected with poor quality assembly of the pipeline. By November 6th, fuel began to arrive at the Army Depot in Pulikumri. After the completion of work, 13 men from my team, including me, were submitted for government awards. About 30 men from the Pipeline Brigade in November departed for deployment of a pipeline in the direction Kushka to Ragandi, Ditiin. I returned to command my platoon, but on December 12th, I was called to the brigade commander, who offered me the position of commander of 1st Company of the 2nd Battalion. The appointment was unexpected, but I felt that the performance of these duties was within my siya. Upon arrival at the command post of the 2nd Battalion, I reported to the commander, Major V.V. Unenchinev. We immediately went around the garrisons to present me to the personnel and to become acquainted with the company sector. I had to do much so that the company would reach advanced positions. It was necessary to seriously work on strengthening military discipline. The company control point, which until then had been Rashpelozheny, on the outskirts, far from the personnel, had to be moved and placed together with the pumping station. For 6 days already, the PNU 100-200M unit stood idle at the company control point, which had to be urgently delivered to NS-15, but this proved impossible. With comfortable, by our standards, conditions at the company control point, personnel at the garrisons of pumping stations lived in unattractive conditions. At pumping station NS-17, construction of an intermediate reservoir group was dragging on unjustifiably long. It was necessary to eliminate all of the перечисления and many other shortcomings as well, especially in arranging the personnel, increasing military discipline, and reducing fuel losses. But we still achieved improvement. On the company sector, a kind of record was set for daily fuel delivery, 1,350 tons via PMTP-150. Usually, 650 to 750 tons were pumped daily. In 1985, the company took first place in the brigade by results of work. The company operational sector was the largest in the brigade and had a length of nearly 100 kilometers along the combined route. 7 pumping stations operated on the line. At the beginning of the sector was NS-14, near the settlement Ibak, and at the end NS-21, near the brigade command post in Pulikumri. The operational sector was relatively calm. Sabotage by band formations occurred rather rarely, except in the area of the battalion command post, where the terrain was marshy and covered with extensive reed thickets. From these thickets, almost every night, fire was conducted both on the battalion command post and on the pipeline line, but there were no such large-scale sabotages as in the 3rd Battalion. However, taking into account the fairly large length of the operational sector, the pipeline was daily subjected to vehicles and tracked equipment driving over it, sometimes even with quite heavy consequences. One such case occurred in spring 1985. A tank, returning from a Nevnoy outlying post, exceeded speed, failed to hold the road, and at full speed fell from the shoulder, directly onto 2 pipeline lines through which aviation kerosene and diesel fuel were being pumped. Under the weight of the tank, the pipeline was torn in several places, and the leaking fuel instantly ignited from sparks flying out of the exhaust pipe. None of the crew could be saved. There were assumptions that the tankers were without tank helmets and possibly received severe injuries in the fall that did not allow them to leave the tank, but there was also an opinion about the alcohol state of the crew members. Despite the relative safety of the company operational sector, nevertheless, on June 3rd, 1985, the company control point was fired upon, and I received my 2nd wound, but already quite severe. After undergoing treatment in Tashkent for a month and a half, at the beginning of August, I returned to my former place of service. On November 1st, 1985, the brigade commander, Lieutenant Colonel B.R. Kagramayan, presented me with the Order of the Red Star. And on November 5th, having handed over affairs and the position of commander of 1st Company of 2nd Pipeline Battalion to Senior Lieutenant V.A. Dunin, I departed on replacement to the Belarusian military district. In my recollections of Afghanistan, I have touched only a few moments of my service, but from these moments was made up the everyday life of all pipeline soldiers, from the soldier to the brigade commander. We successfully coped with our tasks, even despite the fact that daily, risking our lives, we had to go out to eliminate sabotage and accidents, often entering into battle with the Dushmans. A special role I would like to assign to the 3rd Pipeline Battalion, which was unofficially called Guards, and in my opinion, it fully deserved that title. Despite the fact that service in Afghanistan was rather difficult and dangerous, I recall this time with gratitude, and consider the years spent there the best and most useful years of my service, although later there was also Chernobyl in my military fate, and service in other places.
From 1984 to 1986, as commander of the 1461st Separate Pipeline Battalion, I served in Afghanistan. The battalion was formed in the city of Smila on the basis of a unit stationed there, and was additionally manned with personnel from the Pipeline Brigade of the Belarusian military district. There, the battalion underwent combat coordination, during which personnel acquired certain skills in deployment and operation of the PMTP-150, communications equipment, engineering, and other special equipment. Considerable assistance in forming the battalion and preparing it for deployment was provided by all rear services of the district, headed by Deputy Chief of the Rear A.D. Lopatin and Chief of the Fuel Service V.N. Cooley. Movement of the battalion to the destination, without pipeline sets, was carried out by 2 railway echelons, and on the 30th of November 1984, we concentrated at the pipeline's initial point. 2 PMTP-150 sets had been delivered to this area even before our arrival. Within 5 days, the pipeline and all special equipment were prepared for deployment, which began on the 14th of December 1984. Pipes were delivered to 3 temporary storage points. Within 10 days, 220 kilometers of pipeline were laid from the district fuel depot to the Army fuel depot, and on the 3rd of January 1985, fuel was supplied to the terminal point. Due to low temperatures during this period, hydraulic testing and pressure testing of the pipeline were conducted with the pumped fuel, by sections from one pumping station to another during line filling. The pipeline route ran along an automobile road and crossed 2 passes, one at 1580 meters and one at 1724 meters. For fuel pumping, 22 pumping stations were deployed using paired P&U 100/200M units. Control of pipeline operation and command over subunits was exercised by the battalion command post in 3 operational company control points. Both the road and the pipeline deployed along it were the responsibility zone of a motor rifle division. There were no road command and service units in this direction. Route security was provided by guard outposts and separate posts established during daylight hours. Later, they were combined with our pumping stations. For reinforcement of combat capabilities, 1 armored personnel carrier or infantry fighting vehicle from motor rifle subunits was allocated to each pumping station. Monthly fuel pumping along the pipeline was conducted for 20 to 25 days. Throughput amounted to 1,500 to 2,000 tons per day, with combat losses of 2 to 5%. During pipeline operation, many issues had to be resolved regarding rear, technical, and medical support of personnel, command and communications, and interaction with motor rifle units. Operation of a 220-kilometer pipeline, practically 1.5 battalion sets, was complicated by insufficient personnel, vehicles, and armored equipment. To manage fuel pumping, it was necessary to train and involve officers of the command group, including chiefs of finance, clothing, and food services, the Komsomol organization secretary, and others, since the pipeline deployment and operation engineer and the assistant chief of staff physically could not carry such prolonged duty. Under those conditions, there was no other solution. However, within half a year, many problems were resolved on-site by the command and the chief of the rear of the 40th Army, A.K. Zhukov. We were additionally allocated 5 KAMAZ 5-20 trucks for the delivery of materiel, 2 BRDM-2 reconnaissance vehicles, and 8 BTR-60 P armored personnel carriers for organizing patrols along the pipeline route. This equipment was distributed among the companies, which subsequently made it possible to successfully resolve all issues of the battalion's combat activity. The command of the Motor Rifle Division also assisted us by allocating 40 to 50 personnel from its reserve, who were distributed among the pumping station garrisons. I wish to express gratitude for the understanding and substantial practical assistance, especially in the initial period, rendered by division officers. Commander Kasparovich, the Regimental Commander U.B. Sivov, the Army Rear Chief A.K. Zhukov, the Army Rear Chief of Staff V.M. Moskovchenko, and Army Service officers. They promptly and positively resolved any issues with which my deputies and I had to approach them. From the first days in Afghanistan, the battalion command gave priority attention to establishing pumping station garrisons, company control points, and the battalion command post, as well as to their rear and medical support. Special attention was given to organizing personnel nutrition. Each pumping station garrison had a compact Mk-10 kitchen with a set of thermoses, a TSV-4 unit for creating and storing water reserves with disinfection and purification means, and separate containers for disinfecting dishes and kitchen equipment. A standard menu layout was drawn up in the battalion, according to which foodstuffs for 7 days were delivered to each garrison. At the battalion command post and company control points, KP-125 kitchens with the appropriate equipment were deployed. TSV-12 trailer water tanks with thermal insulation were available, and KHPI-6 field bakeries were used for bread baking. Bread was baked in each company based on a 2-day requirement and delivered to pumping station garrisons by company first sergeants. By the end of 1985, the garrisons had, by their own efforts, constructed accommodations for personnel, mess halls, storage facilities, and bathhouses. Control over sanitary conditions of food points, personal hygiene of cooks and bakers, and the condition of food warehouses was carried out constantly by the command and the battalion doctor. Great attention was paid to observance of hygiene rules by personnel, proper maintenance of garrison areas with necessary preventative measures, and regular bathing of personnel. Laundry of underwear, bedding, and special clothing was conducted at company control points and at the battalion command post, for which the district allocated severe washing machines. Electrical power for these and other consumers, including televisions at company control points, was supplied by diesel generators included in the sets of troposphere communication stations. Timely preventative measures, including various vaccinations, monitoring of drinking regimen and nutrition, as well as the great persistence and initiative of the unit doctor V.L. Shilov, made it possible to preserve personnel health, significantly reduce morbidity, increase work capacity, and enhance the combat activity of subunits. Daily monitoring of equipment condition and maintenance was carried out by company commanders and senior technicians who knew the equipment perfectly. Thanks to them, senior warrant officers Miroshnishenko, Davidov, Shemet, Kalashenko, there were no disruptions or stoppages of pumping throughout the entire period. The entire complex of these measures was continuously improved. Accumulated experience was passed on to newly arrived officers, warrant officers, sergeants, and soldiers. Company Commander O.A. Markov compiled a handbook with answers to all questions of company daily life. The tactics of band formation's impact on the pipeline constantly changed. One method consisted of damaging the pipeline by detonation, shooting, or ignition of fuel, and setting up ambushes on both sides of the damaged area. These ambushes prevented patrol repair teams from approaching the site and eliminating the damage. It was necessary to request assistance from motor rifle units, eliminate the ambushes, and only after that restore pipeline operability.
Механик, в укрытие! Второй, я первый. Стой, к бою! Я первый, прием! Понял, я второй, прием!
Sometimes entire sections of the line were put out of action by shooting up 10 or more pipes and planting mines. This prolonged the time required to eliminate damage on those sections. It was necessary to request reinforcement of security during repairs. There were many other stratagems and variants, and we constantly had to change something and act according to the specific situation. For a long time, a controversial and difficult issue with motor rifle units and even higher command was the determination of the amount of losses for various types of sabotage and damage to the pipeline. For each case of damage, an act was drawn up and signed by both sides, us and the guarding side. Thus each defended itself and proved that the fault lay with the other side. Meanwhile, in monthly orders, those deemed responsible were punished for poor security conditions, including materially. When General A.M. Serenko arrived to inspect us, I explained this problem to him and asked that temporary and quantitative norms of losses for various types of pipeline damage under real combat conditions be legalized. Practical studies of these loss norms were conducted under his leadership in the 276th Pipeline Brigade, after which the norms were approved by the Army Commander. Upon receiving this document, together with the commanders of motor rifle subunits and chiefs of pumping stations, we conducted instructor classes, after which all disputes on these issues ceased. Soldiers of motor rifle subunits even began assisting patrol repair teams in eliminating accidents and extinguishing fires, which occurred in 70% of pipeline damage cases. Under the difficult climatic conditions of Afghanistan, dust storms, temperature changes, pressure fluctuations in passes, etc., pipeline equipment demonstrated high reliability, strength, and operability, provided competent technical maintenance and operation. Pumping stations operated 20 to 25 days per month. In summer daytime, pipes and fittings heated to such an extent that they could not be touched by hand. Over 2 years of PMT P-150 operation, only a small number of pipe joints had to be reassembled and parts replaced due to capillary leaks. Pipes were replaced only where there was significant damage, including bullet holes, detonations, or armored vehicle impacts. A weak point in the P&E 100/200M pumps was the seals and the mechanical face bearing. The spare parts kit contained an insufficient quantity for replacement during such a long operating period. Tests of the liquid flow meter yielded negative results, as the counting mechanism after a short period of operation became clogged with metal fragments from bullets and failed. The effectiveness of pipeline equipment operation can be judged by the duration of its use under such harsh conditions. Regarding issues of employment and further development of pipeline troops, in my opinion, it is necessary to improve such a structural unit as the battalion, which can be used even in the conditions of conflicts occurring in the world today. However, it should be given greater autonomy and re-equipped with modern equipment and special means enabling independent resolution of all issues of deployment, security and defense, engineering preparation of routes, and life support facilities. For fulfillment of combat operations in the armed forces, I was awarded the orders for service to the motherland in the armed forces, 3rd class, and the Red Star. Other incentives were as for all servicemen, valuable gifts, commendations, and certificates. I was discharged from the armed forces in 1988 from the position of chief of a fuel base. After transfer to the reserve, I worked in the association Ukretransnefteprodukt, the production association Ukreneftprodukt, and currently in the agro holding company Ukreneftprodukt, in the positions of lead engineer, chief specialist, and head of the pipeline transport department. The experience I acquired during military service, including in pipeline units, not only proved useful, but also enabled me to master functional duties quickly and adapt rapidly to new conditions of civilian employment. I wish to express gratitude to those who taught me at all stages of my service, assisted my professional development, and supported me in difficult circumstances. To all my comrades in arms, I bow before the soldiers and sergeants of the unit who honorably endured all hardships and adversities that fell to their lot, constantly demonstrating bravery and courage, risking their lives, and fulfilling all combat missions assigned to them. During my period in the unit, 4 personnel were killed, including Company Commander G. Baryshov. 12 were wounded to varying degrees of severity, and more than 30% of personnel were awarded government decorations.
The decision of the USSR government to introduce troops into Afghanistan in December of 1979 found me serving as a commander of a pipeline battalion in the Moscow military district. In early February 1980, I was summoned to Moscow by the chief of the Central Directorate of Fuel and Pipeline Lubrication, Colonel General V.V. Nikitin. Having described the fuel service situation in the formations and units of the OKSV, he assigned me the task of organizing the deployment of 2 lines of a field trunk pipeline across the Amu Darya River. I knew that the officers of our brigade, Lieutenant Colonel G.I. Komsakov, the brigade chief of staff, and Major K.G. Shein, deputy brigade commander for armament, had successfully deployed and operated 2 PMT-150 pipelines across the Amu Darya in January. However, leakage developed in the underwater sections of the pipeline, which caused pollution of the river. I proposed laying a more reliable PMT-P150 pipeline across the river, and Colonel General V.V. Nikitin approved this plan. 2 days after the conversation, I flew to the place where the mission was to be carried out, and in the border city of Termez met with Lieutenant Colonel G.I. Komsakov and Major K.G. Shein. They briefed me in detail on the operation of the pipeline laid across the water obstacle, introduced me to the commanders of the subunits and units operating the pontoon bridge across the Amu Darya, and the next day departed for their permanent duty station. During that period, only a pontoon bridge functioned across the Amu Darya as a crossing. Over it, combat equipment, personnel, and all material except fuel entered Afghan territory. The main quantity of fuel was delivered via the underwater pipeline to the depot at Khairaton and by tank barges to the port of Sherkan. Before the arrival by rail of the PMT P150 pipes and equipment, I arranged with the Termez port leadership for the allocation of a boat, and with the help of the commander of an engineer pontoon unit, studied the character of the water obstacle. And it was not entirely pleasant. Current speeds up to 2.6 meters per second, depths varying over time, river width up to 800 meters. At the same time, I helped the commander of a separate pipeline platoon, Senior Lieutenant N.I. Ermakov, in developing the technological piping schemes for tying in the fuel depot and the pipeline. Finally, the railcars with the pipes and equipment arrived. I planned to carry out the laying of the pipeline across the Amu Darya by the most common method, dragging along the bottom, with prior assembly of pipeline sections on the bank and a sandbar in the middle of the river. By boat, the end of a towing cable was delivered to the left bank. There, we used a tank as the tractor and laid 3 PMT-P150 pipelines across the river, one of which was a reserve. Having ensured the reliability of the pipeline's operation, especially its underwater section, I reported completion of the tasks to the Chief of the Central Directorate of Fuel of the Moscow Military District, Colonel General V.V. Nikitin, after which I departed for my unit. The war in Afghanistan continued, more and more fuel was required. From the fuel depot located in Khairaton, fuel was delivered to all units and subunits of the limited contingent of Soviet forces, mainly by motor transport, which barely coped with the current needs, not to mention the creation of any reserves. In this connection, a decision was made to lay a field trunk pipeline from Khairaton to Pul-i-Kumri. On the 3rd of May 1980, Colonel General Nikitin assigned Lieutenant Colonel G.I. Komsakov and myself to assist the 14th Separate Pipeline Battalion in deploying the pipeline and organizing fuel pumping into the territory of Afghanistan. On the 5th of May, we arrived in the battalion's concentration area near the city of Termez, close to the state border. With the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel V.V. Valechko, the Chief of Staff, Major I.I. Kuzin, and the Deputy Battalion Commander of Technical Matters, Major S.P. Kodonev, we clarified the battalion's manning status. The pipes by that time had only begun to arrive by rail. Battalion personnel were unloading them and hauling them to the concentration area. Taking advantage of the available time reserve, we decided to conduct a preliminary reconnaissance on the route. From the map, we determined 2 possible variants, and the next morning crossed the state border. The group included the Deputy Chief of the Fuel Service of the Turkestan Military District, Lieutenant Colonel U.P. Belousov, the Chief of Staff of the Pipeline Brigade of the Moscow Military District, Major B.R. Kagramanyan, the Chief of Staff of the 14th OTPB, Major I. Kuzin, and the Senior Engineer of the 14th OTPB, Major V.N. Volodin, company commanders, and a squad of soldiers. In a ZIL-131 truck and a BTR-60, we began movement from Khairaton in the direction of Kunduz to Tashkurgan to Pul-e-Kumri. The proposed route ran along a steppe dirt road transitioning into mountainous terrain. Along the way, we encountered neither guard outposts nor fortified points of our forces. And by day's end, we arrived in Kunduz, where the headquarters of the 201st Motor Rifle Division was located. The information received in the operations section of the division headquarters, intensive activity of band formations, absence of roads and guard outposts, forced us to abandon deploying the pipeline along that direction and to adopt the variant of deploying along the automobile road from Khairaton to Tashkurgan to Pul-e-Kumri. We plan to reconnoiter this route during the preparation of the 14th OTPB for pipeline deployment. Early on a May morning, the head of the 14th OTPB column crossed the state border and, via the pontoon bridge, reached the Afghan bank. Having concentrated 2 kilometers from Khairaton, the battalion began preparing to deploy the pipeline. Taking into account the route's complexity and the activity of sabotage groups, it was necessary to assemble 254 kilometers of pipeline in 6 days. However, due to heightened band activity, a shortage of vehicles, a long-haul distance for pipe delivery, and an incomplete working day, work on the route after 1600 hours was prohibited by the commander of 40th Army, the task was completed in 10 days. Work was organized clearly. Every officer and soldier felt a high level of responsibility. Fuel was delivered to the depot in the Pul-e-Kumri area. The successful completion of the task by the pipeline troops was also conditioned by good organization of coordination with fuel depots and motor rifle units, which was established immediately upon the battalion's arrival in the Khairaton area. Interaction with the fuel depots covered issues of organizing security and defense, use of pumping means, receipt and pumping of fuel, technological connection schemes for attaching the pipeline to depots, organization of communications, and economic activity. Coordination with the commanders of the motor rifle units located along the supply route was organized already during route reconnaissance. They provided the Pipeline Battalion staff with information about the nature of sabotage group actions and the disposition of our subunits along the route. Issues were resolved concerning the use, once deployment began, of motor rifle communication means in whose territory, after completion of assembly work, the machine assembly detachments were to concentrate daily. The locations of the battalion command post, company control points for the period of deployment and operation of the pipeline, and intermediate reservoir groups were selected and coordinated so as to maximize use of the motor rifle unit's capabilities for combat cover of the pipeline battalion subunits and facilities. Later, during pipeline operation, coordination became even closer. Issues of security and defense, economic activity, information on the military, political situation, and so forth were resolved jointly. Having completed the task set by the Chief of the Central Directorate of Fuel of the Moscow Military District, G.I. Komsakov and I departed for our unit. In the summer of 1981, our brigade was mobilized under wartime tables of organization for extinguishing fires in Moscow Oblast. Having formed my battalion, I departed with it to the Shatur area. During the period of firefighting, the battalion supplied more than 1.5 million cubic meters of water, saved 13,000 tons of peat, and 140 hectares of forest plantations. Having completed its task, the battalion arrived at its permanent station at the end of August. On the 24th of that same month, without having finished disbanding the battalion, I was summoned to the Chief of the Central Directorate of Fuel of the Moscow Military District. Colonel General Nikitin tasked me to lay 2 pipelines across the Amudarya below the bridge under construction, and to conduct reconnaissance of the Pul-e-Kumri to Bagram route, paying special attention to overcoming the Solong Pass. On the 28th of August, at the presumed river crossing site, we met with the Deputy Chief of the Fuel Service of the Turkestan Military District, Lieutenant Colonel U.P. Belousov. He reported that 4 of the 5 pipelines laid across the river were located between the pontoon bridge and the capital bridge under construction. In the event of an accident on the pipeline, an unpleasant situation could arise. Therefore, the pipeline had to be laid downstream from the bridge. At that time of year, the Amudarya had become very shallow. Sandbars and islands appeared in the channel, and the current speed reached more than 3 meters per second, and the width was 1,500 meters. If the issue of allocating a tug with the river people was resolved immediately, then we managed to obtain a tank tractor on only the 4th of September from a tank division when it returned after carrying out a combat task. The same day we began transferring the cable to the left bank. In some places ships were scraping the sandbars with their bottoms. We successfully pulled a 1,400 meter long cable, but when 100 meters remained to the bank, it snapped, evidently due to cutting into the ground on the sandbars. The next day this operation passed successfully. Using the cable, the tank tractor began dragging the pipeline. The pipe end did not reach the bank by about 300 meters and ran into the river bottom. Then, we used a compressor to pump air into the line. It began to float up. Periodically tensioning the line with the tractor, we freed it from the sandy trap and safely pulled the pipe onto the bank. After connecting the underwater section to the main pipeline and displacing the water from it with fuel, I reported to Colonel General V.V. Nikitin that the first part of the task assigned had been completed and received authorization to carry out the second task. When I left Moscow, the chief of the Central Directorate of Fuel of the Moscow Military District handed me a mandate signed by Marshal of the Soviet Union S.K. Kurkotin, prescribing to all commanders and chiefs that they render me assistance in fulfilling the assigned task. On the 16th of September, I crossed the state border and by passing transport reached the command post of the 14th OTPB, where the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel V.V. Velechko, allocated a BTR to my disposal. By the end of the day, I arrived in Puli Kumri. On the outskirts of the settlement was a fuel depot to which fuel was supplied by pipeline. In this garrison were located a motor rifle regiment, a material support brigade, a hospital, depots, and other rear units and subunits. I began reconnaissance of the Puli Kumri to Bagram route early in the morning on the 8th of September. The automobile road had many bridges and sharp turns, climbs and descents, and large differences in elevation. Many sections of the route were subject to snow avalanches, mud flows, and rock falls. One of the difficult issues was how to overcome the Salang Pass, located at an altitude of 3,363 meters above sea level. On the pass, the road went through a tunnel, 3,255 meters long, and a gallery, 2,000 meters long. Having spoken with the chief engineer for tunnel works at the pass, V.A. Zayats, and having studied the technical documentation, I concluded that the pipeline laying could be carried out only in 2 ways. First, through the ventilation channel, second, through the tunnel itself, along the sidewalk. During the reconnaissance, I collected necessary information: the behavior of the local population, the intensity of sabotage group actions, the possibility of passage in the autumn to winter period, and how road security was organized. Having generalized the results of the work, I prepared a report and presented it to Colonel General Nikitin in mid-September. The main conclusion: the pipeline on the Puli Kumri to Bagram section can be laid and operated. However, a number of measures must be provided. It was necessary to strengthen security not only of pumping stations but also of the pipeline route using motor rifle divisions, units, and subunits, especially in populated areas. A large amount of engineering work was required, prepared sites for deployment of pumping stations, preventing, by use of metal stakes, the pipeline from slipping in gorges. In terms of technology, it was proposed to install additional check valves and gate valves in the line and to overcome the Salang Pass only via the tunnel. In winter, when road clearing of snow is carried out by bulldozers, it was recommended to strengthen observation and guarding of the pipeline. Finally, in organizational measures, I proposed that the Pipeline Battalion should have not 2, but 3 companies, which would reduce the lengths of operational sectors and improve control. V.V. Nikitin approved the work performed. It proved not to have been in vain. In the summer of 1982, on the basis of the 14th OTPB, a pipeline brigade was formed, which laid a PMTP 100 pipeline from Puli Kumri to Bagram with a length of 176 kilometers. My proposals and recommendations were used in laying and operating the pipeline on that section. In June of 1985, I was appointed commander of the 276 Pipeline Brigade in the Republic of Afghanistan. It had been formed on the 28th of August 1982, consisted of 3 battalions, and operated 435 kilometers of pipeline in 2 lines along a combined route from Haidaton to Bagram, 40 kilometers north of Kabul. I became convinced that the route was difficult back in 1981 when I conducted reconnaissance here. It passed through 3 passes, one of which had an elevation mark of 3,564 meters, and through a tunnel and a gallery with a total length of 4,255 meters. Protection, security, and defense of the pipeline were complicated by the presence of a large number of populated localities along the route. The population living along the route constantly damaged pipes with the aim of stealing fuel both for their own needs and for sale. The presence of mountains, rocks, gorges, and green zones along the route allowed band formations to act actively even in daylight hours. In 1986 alone, on the brigade's operational sector, 2,509 accidents and damages were recorded. Most often, pipes were shot through and punctured, 722 and 807 cases respectively, and sawn through in 125 cases. 122 fires were noted, 241 natural disasters with pipeline damage, and 153 impacts by automotive or tractor equipment. Despite all these difficulties, we carried out our task. During the period when I was commander of the Pipeline Brigade, from June of 1985 to June of 1987, more than 120,000 tons of fuel were delivered to the troops. The brigade command devoted great attention to the living conditions of personnel. Each garrison had a bathhouse and household washing machines, and the battalion had an MMP2 laundry. Food was prepared in small capacity kitchens. We even had our own bread baking points. Personnel were housed in the premises built by our own forces. All garrisons were equipped from the engineering standpoint. Equipment was placed in shelters. Security and defense of all garrisons were organized clearly. Over 9 years on the Haidaton to Bagram route, 4,332 pipeline soldiers passed an exam in mastery and courage, including 430 officers, 316 warrant officers, 3,316 sergeants and soldiers. The motherland highly valued their military labor. For courage and heroism displayed in the performance of duty, 255 servicemen were awarded orders and medals. While carrying out the combat tasks of pumping fuel, 98 servicemen were killed by bullets, mines, and fires, including 16 officers. In August of 1987, I was appointed head of the Department of Field Pipelines at the Ulyanovskaya Military Technical School. Here, my combat experience proved useful. During my service at the department, I published training manuals for pipeline specialists, and also for cadets of the school, on the tactics of actions of pipeline units and formations, command and control of pipeline troops, planning the rollback, that is to say, shutdown and withdrawal of a pipeline in a defensive operation, taking into account reverse pumping, movement of a pipeline unit by rail, and many others. At the same time, work was carried out on construction, reconstruction, and introduction into the training process of the department's training material base, a lecture hall with a diorama, a methodological classroom, a room for the history of the pipeline troops and the department, various classrooms on tactics of pipeline units, subunits for laboratory classes, a trainer for controlling pipeline subunits, and others. We reconstructed the pipeline training range and carried out other measures aimed at improving the quality of training of future pipeline officers. During the period of service in the armed forces, for diligence shown in fulfilling of assigned tasks, I was awarded government decorations, the Order of the Red Star, the medals for combat merit, and for bravery at a fire.
In December 1981, a group of generals and rear service officers, headed by the Chief of Staff of the Rear of the Armed Forces, Colonel General I.M. Galushko, was working with the 40th Army in the DRA. By that time, a field trunk pipeline from Haidaton to Puli Khumri had already been deployed on Afghan territory and was in operation. I recall an incident when a column of fuel tanker trucks departing from the fuel depot at Puli Khumri was blocked and fired upon by Dushmans while ascending the Saleng Pass. This incident was not an isolated one. Such occurrences happened quite frequently. While analyzing the causes of what had happened, Colonel General I.M. Galushko proposed that I study the feasibility of laying a field pipeline across the Saleng Pass, granting 1 day for this task. The already deployed pipeline was being operated by a pipeline battalion whose command post was located in Hairatan. Having summoned the battalion chief of staff, Major I.S. Chekhanovsky, to Puli Khumri, we together set about solving the assigned problem. After carrying out the necessary map calculations and reconnaissance directly on the ground, I reported to Colonel General I.M. Galushko that, both theoretically and practically, the laying and operation of a field pipeline across the Saleng Pass were possible. However, this would require enormous efforts in selecting sites for the arrangement and equipping, with the involvement of engineer units, of platforms on rock faces for the placement of pumping station garrisons, as well as a significant increase in pipeline equipment, materiel, and personnel due to the complex terrain and the structural features of the Saleng Pass itself. This once again confirms what Vasily Vasilyevich said earlier regarding the understanding by senior military leaders of the importance of employing pipeline troops under extreme conditions. Subsequently, a field trunk pipeline across the Saleng Pass was laid and operated successfully. My service developed in such a way that, almost from the very beginning of my officer career, I was involved in work with field trunk pipelines, and I consider this to be one of the most important stages of my life. I am grateful to fate for having been given a real opportunity to contribute, however modestly, to the establishment and development of this most important means of fuel transportation.
А где-то за Джейбаром раскололась тишина, и выстрелы в ущелье прогремели. А мы с тобой, товарищ, мы с тобой идем туда, где бьют в лицо свинцовые метели. Мы не за славой шли, мы выполняли долг, и пусть солдатский путь наш был короток. Вы, кто сюда придет, вы вспомните о нас на безымянном павших повороте. И снова где-то бой, и снова пулям тесно, и снова чей-то скрип, и кто-то мать зовет, заплачет дома мать, и загрустит невеста, но сын твой, мама, он не придет. Пусть годы пролетят, как пролетают птицы, и дни проходят долгой, длинной чередой, а мне все по ночам мой друг погибший снится, один из тех, кто не пришел домой. А ты, Афганистан, ты боль и гордость наша, ты должен вечно помнить тех молоденьких ребят, всех тех, кто в 20 лет, всех, кто в Афганистане останутся под звездами лежать. Пусть годы пролетят, как пролетают птицы, и дни проходят долгой, длинной чередой, а мне все по ночам мой друг погибший снится, один из тех, кто не пришел домой.